Welcome everybody. My name is Jack and it's my honor to be the MC for this virtual forum. Thank you very much for the honor of attending this Nation Forum. We now have with us here a government operator, provider, and issuer, and we have the opportunity to discuss this issue from multiple perspectives. So I'd like to start with Kun Thawatchai, the Assistant Secretary General Legal of the Security and Exchange Commission of Thailand, which is an operator. What is the status of regulatory reforms as of the present moment in terms of simultaneously safeguarding consumers and service providers?
Thank you, Kun Jack. Let me start with this. And you will see that we have the development law about the regulations on this digital asset. And that's because the industry moves so fast. And when we look at the international practices and law, we will see other jurisdictions, they change and they introduce new law to deal with this kind of issue as well. And you can see that in the short term, we're trying to raise the protection for the investor in terms of the put some kind of business conducts that for the business operators to keep pace with the changes. For example, you see the proposals to change the law on the advertisement, and this on the public hearing, because we see that this kind of issue would be very important to be addressed. And on the wrong land, you will see the last year we proposed the amendment to the Securities and Exchange Act as well. That's to change the landscape of the supervisions that we're trying to shift the digital assets, whereby the substance is like securities to the Securities and Exchange Act, because if it is like the securities, it is supposed to be regulated as a securities, but you will not see it in the very short term, because the proposing the amendment to the law will take some time, and it's not the thing that we should expect it in the very recent years. And apart from that, we also proposed the change on the Securities and Exchange Act to allow the existing digital asset operators to participate in the securities law arena as well. As you see, once we shift this digital asset from the digital asset law to the securities regulations, we can't just leave the operators there. We have to open for them to apply for the license for securities trading center as well. And that's how they could, continue their business as the operators for the products that have been changed from the supervisions under the digital asset law to the securities regulations. Well, I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Chia, can you tell us in what the regulatory situation is in Singapore in comparison? Is there anything that you would see that compares or contrasts with Thailand's?
I think the regulations in Singapore and Thailand are quite similar. So in Singapore, the regulator will categorize the token, whether is it the payments token, securities token, or utility tokens. So if it is a payments token, which the majority of the cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, Ethereum falls under this category, they are licensed under the Payments Services Act, which came into effect in January 2020. But if it's securities in nature, like it's like a debt or it has equity rights, then it's regulated under the Securities Futures Act. But if it is the utility in nature, for example, most non-fungible tokens are digital collectibles and art. Those are utility in nature, they are not regulated. But having said that, the regulator, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, has stated many times that they will look at the actual substance of the token rather than looking at how the market player labels it. So if it walks like a duck, quack like a duck, it is a duck. So those are the things that are quite clear in Singapore.
Okay.
Thanks.
One of our previous speakers from Singapore, he mentioned that Singapore was looking at taxing sales of NFTs.
Yes, that has been mentioned recently. So basically, it's like a sales tax in Singapore. So sales tax are applicable. However, in Singapore, there's no capital gains tax. Having said that, if you trade NFTs for a living, is your full-time job, right? Then the income tax will apply. So that's the tax regulation now for NFTs. In contrast to cryptocurrencies, there's no sales tax. Yeah.
Okay. Kun Korn, you have a unique perspective as a former finance minister of Thailand, but also as the founder of the Thai Fintech Association. What are your thoughts on how digital assets should be regulated, especially with the current state of digital assets, tokenization, and cryptocurrency? Hello, sorry, Kun Korn, I think your microphone may be muted.
Yeah, my apologies.
No problem.
My apologies. Yeah, I was just saying that I come from 20-year background of being in the equities business, in the securities business, and throughout that period worked with the SEC since its formation in its regulatory approach to the securities industry. And I see a lot of similarity in mindset of what the SEC is trying to do with the crypto world. But there are some critical differences, which I think means that the SEC should need to account for. But first of all, the control of the local securities industry is easier simply because there are boundaries. The local market trades locally listed securities which cannot be traded elsewhere. So it's quite easy to basically control what the activities of investors in the local market do. The big difference with the crypto market is the opportunity for local investors, local traders, to choose to trade elsewhere or through an unregulated exchange. And that makes it really quite tricky, I think, for the regulators, because they may want to impose certain controls and certain restrictions on local exchanges. But all that typically means is that investors are turned off by trading through a regulated local exchange and instead direct their investments through unregulated foreign exchanges, which I think is a net loss for the Thai crypto industry or the ecosystem. So that poses a particular challenge. And so my view is that regulators should perhaps tread carefully in terms of trying to impose their will onto an industry which they can't fully control. And I think they have to admit the fact that they can't fully control it, and attempting to do so may basically just be pushing activities offshore or underground, which I don't think is beneficial to anybody. And I think that is the major challenge.
Okay, thank you very much. Kun Jirayut, Bitkub is a service provider here in Thailand. Now, having heard that, I'm sure you have some ideas or recommendations if you could offer what you feel like would be helpful in a regulatory situation. What do you think is the most concerning aspects of doing business on these digital asset trading platforms, and how do you think regulators could view the way to approach putting some restrictions on it that are not going to strangle the development of these exchanges?
Sure. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this talk. I have always been saying that Bitkub is not a financial company, And at the same time, Bitkub is not a technology company. I've been stating from day one that Bitkub Group is a fintech group of companies, right? We cannot move fast and break things like Facebook as a tech company because we hold a lot of customers' assets. We cannot take crazy risks, right? But at the same time, we cannot move too slow like a financial company because we are living in a very different world now. We are living in a digital world. The world is not moving in a linear manner anymore. The world is moving in an exponential manner, right? Those that can see the next S-curve, next opportunity could bring tremendous growth to the country. Innovation has to be one of the main country's KPIs and metrics going forward, pretty much every nation. So I think the vision is to make sure that either private companies or the regulators see this industry as a fintech space, right? Not too extreme on either end. We need to find the right balance between being moving fast and breaking things and being compliant and investors protection. Right? So this is finding the sweet spot between the old, making sure the old world is happy with KYC, AML, account verifications, investor protection, but at the same time, we cannot temper growth with too much restriction. Cannot forcing too much regulation. In a way, forcing local players to bring a knife to a gunfight, right? With foreign players. Otherwise, we'll lose competitive advantage, and eventually the share of world trade would be reduced for Thailand, and as a result, we won't be capturing on the next S-curve in the next decade. The arrival of Web3. So I guess the key is to find the right balance and making sure that for every regulations that comes out, we think through looking through from different angles, from different dimensions, making sure that we seek advice from various stakeholders to find the right a balance between. I guess the key is not to go for one particular KPI. We have to aggregate all the KPIs and make sure that we take one step back. Each take one step back and make sure we have a global country's KPI that is best for the country. To make sure that we have to have this conductor, making sure that all the musician plays the same songs. I guess that's the key, and making sure that the regulation can adapt really fast, very flexible, because the world is changing very fast. Technology is developed very fast. So the regulations has to be able to adapt very fast also. Thank you.
Thank you, Jirayut. Kun Thawatchai, if we take digital assets and divide them into, say, 3 categories of cryptocurrencies, securities, and utilities, could you give us an idea, broadly speaking, of how you think that they should be regulated and how they should be separated if possible?
Well, I think to answer this question, I'd like to lay down the principle of the regulations under the, I could say, Thai DA law. And this law is modeled after the Securities and Exchange Act of 1992. And we separated the supervision into 3 main parts. And the first one is the fundraising that's applicable to the digital tokens. That means the issuers that want to raise funds to the issuance of the digital tokens, that's comprising the investment tokens and utilities token, which is not offer the ready to use to the exchange to acquire the goods and services or any other rights, need to be approved by the SEC. And the information disclosure must be made to the filing of the registration statement and prospectus. You can see that when I mentioned it, it's pretty much the same as the rules apply to the offering of the securities, because the substance of these digital assets is similar to the securities that I mentioned earlier, that in the future, we're gonna move these kind of assets to the Securities and Exchange law in the future. And that's the first part. And the second part is the supervision on the business operators. That includes the broker, dealer, exchange, fund manager, and investment advisor. These operators need to be obtained a license from the finance minister, and to be qualified to obtain the license, they have to have the proper, fit and proper directors, senior management, and they have to have the system in place, to use for the business operations. And after obtaining the license, they have to comply with the conduct of business. That's pretty much for the summary. And the last part would be the provision and the prevention of the unfair trading practices, which is also modeled after the Securities and Exchange Act, because although the products are different, but the fundamentals to supervise the order markets to let the investor have the confidence through trading in the digital asset exchange need to be regulated as well. And that's we are talking about the false dissemination, market manipulation, and insider trading. That will be in short for the framework, and you will see that how we operated under the Thai DA law. When talking about the difference between the type of the digital assets, I talked about the digital tokens already, but the other type is the cryptocurrency. And this kind of digital asset is not subject to the provision of the fundraising, because its nature is not supposed to be used to raise fund. But for the business operator that would like to deal with this cryptocurrency need to have the license as well. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so Mr. Chia, how do we balance safe and sensible regulations, especially when we have a lot of providers and investors who are concerned about fairness and safety?
I would like to quote a phrase given by the Managing Director of the Monetary Authority of Singapore in 2016, when Singapore embarked on our ambition to become a leading fintech hub. So he mentioned three things. First, regulations should not front-run innovation. That means that regulators should not be too eager to start regulating a new innovation before it has a chance to nurture itself. The second principle is that the regulators should keep abreast of what is happening in the industry and be ready to regulate once a risk becomes material. For example, cryptocurrency trading volume in Singapore is only less than 2% of traditional equities. In terms of derivatives, it's less than 1%, and only 0.1% of the funds manage any kind of cryptocurrency fund. So there is no systemic risk to the financial stability. However, there might be a material risk in terms of money laundering and terrorist financing, which is why the current Payment Services Act focus on the money laundering part. And the third principle is what we call as the proportionality test. Basically, when we decided to regulate, the regulatory intensity should be proportionate to the kind of risk. We should not be, for example, using a banking regulation to regulate a digital asset exchange, because the kind of risk they present is very different. Last but not least, I think the other way to manage this is really through the use of regulatory sandbox. In fact, in Singapore, we have 3 regulatory sandbox: a standard one, an express version, and a recently introduced one called the Sandbox Plus. And that Sandbox Plus is targeted at new innovations like decentralized finance. So I think this is a good way to manage both innovation and risk. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chia. And Kun Korn, I'd love to hear your perspective on this as far as how we can balance the needs of protecting investors and providers while at the same time allowing for these new industries and areas to grow.
Yeah, I thought that was a very interesting Singapore perspective. I remember very well hearing those 4 mantras back in 2016. And I think Singapore's struck a nice balance so far. And furthermore, I'd like to say that when we formed the Thai Fintech Association, it was very much with the view that the industry, the fintech industry, needs to work closely and hand in hand with regulators. It's important that the industry, because anything to do with finance, the most important thing is trust. And the best way of earning trust of the public is for you to be properly regulated by an acknowledged regulator. And so that's one thing. But getting that balance right, especially in a very fast-moving new sector such as the crypto sector, is definitely a challenge. My view, broadly speaking, I think, to be honest, that the regulators have to quote the Singapore term, front-run development a little bit, and I think have gotten a little ahead of themselves, overzealous a little bit in trying to regulate something that is still very much emerging. The tax issue is a case in point. I just think, we're maybe 2 or 3 years into crypto trading, and already the regulators are taxing capital gains, when in fact they're not even really very ready as to how to go about fairly taxing everybody in an equitable manner. There's still obvious loopholes for Thai investors to be investing, for example, in an overseas exchange that is unregulated by both the securities regulator and the tax authorities. That's making it very unfair to those investors who stick by with the local exchanges that are regulated in terms of tax treatment. So one has to ask the question, the equity market in Thailand is still, after 30 or 40 years since its launch, still exempted from capital gains tax. So why such a hurry to tax crypto, which as a percentage of the overall financial sector is still so small? Why don't we just see how things flow, see how things grow before making that decision? My view is that this overzealousness comes a little bit from a sense of caution and a sense of fear of this new sector. I think traditional regulators are just a little bit afraid of what is clearly an unknown to them. Regulators don't like unknowns, and the crypto sector is a big unknown. And so to that extent, instead of giving it space and letting and seeing how things grow, they decide to clamp down too early. And I think that's a negative. That's a very good reason why equities are exempt of capital gains taxes, because the equity markets and the development of equity markets is deemed to be important to the overall development of the economy. Well, I think I can argue, and I think a lot of people in the technology sector will argue that cryptos and blockchain will be equally, if not more important, to the development of future economies, and to allow this sector to grow and to prosper is of long-term benefit to the country, and thus arguably should be given the same tax treatment as the equity market has always been and still is today. So that's my broad view.
Okay, thank you, Khun Korn. Khun Jirayut, do you agree with this viewpoint, and do you have anything to add with regards to your perspective as a fintech company of how the current trend of regulatory environment in Thailand compared to the markets that may be unregulated or less regulated overseas?
Sure. As Khun Korn was saying earlier, this market is connected globally, and there's no friction to move the network effect elsewhere. Right? There's no barriers to entry. So a country with too much restriction would push innovations to occur elsewhere. But at the same time, with too little restriction, then there will be scams. Investors won't be fully protected. So I guess we have to find the right balance. And I also agree with Khun Korn on the other point in that cryptocurrency and blockchains, they are really the digital infrastructure for the digital economy, for Web3, right? the arrival of Web3. That's going to have a huge impact on the Thai economy in the next decades. Right now, the digital economy in Thailand is accounted for 17% of country's national GDP in 2017, right? But most of the GDP are created from foreign companies. We have the likes of e-commerce businesses, social media apps and sharing apps, ride-sharing apps, hotel sharing apps. Those are foreign, ownerships, service providers in Thailand, accounting for 17%. And Thailand has been, relying on the tourism space as our heavy, weighted. I think 20% of the Thai's GDP came from tourism space. And then after COVID, the tourism space accounted for only 2%. Right, so we need to find the next growth for the next decade for the future of Thailand to escape this middle income trap. And the right metrics to measure for the country as a whole is not GDP. I don't think that's a true representation, because most of the digital economy created in the past were foreigners, and they're not really contributing taxation or giving values back to the country. I think the more accurate measurement is GNP, gross national product. And digital economy should be accounting for at least 50% of GNP in the next decade. And most of the GNP in Thailand would come from digital economy. And in order for digital economy to foster, to grow, we need a strong digital infrastructure. Imagine in the past, without railways, without roads, there will be no logistic, right? Logistic cannot occur without proper roads and railways and or tollways, right? Or SMEs cannot grow in the past decades without banks or stock exchange being the physical infrastructure. Thailand became the Detroit of Asia in the previous decade, became amazing Thailand, top tourism destination in the last decade. But that's the past. The future focus of Thailand should be the digital hub of ASEAN. And in order to achieve that target, we need to have a strong digital infrastructure. And cryptocurrency, blockchain, NFTs, these are critical countries' infrastructure for the next wave of growth. And we should not temper it. We cannot do this premature intervention. We should allow infrastructure to grow. And it will create more opportunities for Thai people to build, new businesses on the new layer going forward.
Thank you. I'd like to give Kun Thawatchai a chance to respond to the opinions that have been expressed here from the side of a fintech company, as well as somebody who is the head of the Fintech Association of Thailand, about this concern that Thailand may be hobbling its own efforts to grow in the digital economy space. Of course, we are rightfully would be concerned about the opportunities for fraud in these markets, as they are in some people describe it as the new wild, wild west, where there's a lot of unknowns and it's a big fog that people are navigating in, and some people are taking advantage of this lack of knowledge among the general public. And I'd like to ask you to respond to these concerns.
Okay, thank you, Kun Jack. Thank you, Kun Korn and Kun Jirayut. And let me put it this way: the SEC value the development of the technologies and innovations, and our mission is to both promote and regulate the digital assets industry. And how to strike the right balance, I would say that we're trying to do this as well, but our aspect would be different, and we have to listen to all the stakeholders, and that's very true. I agree with that. But talking about the regulator's point of view, I think Kun Korn mentioned something about these issues already, but I try to explain this like this: we have to balance. In our view, development of investor protections and mitigation of the risk. And this is very important. I think we all agree with this kind of issues, but the thing is that we would view it in the different ways. So the way to solve this kind of thing, we have to talk about this. And what we value, the technologies you will see our law and regulations, and I'm from the legal side. Maybe I'm talking about something just the law because I'm a lawyer. But the thing is that we embrace the technology as well. You had heard of the projects that initiated by the SEC as to apply the digital infrastructures in the capital markets, and we are trying to use the technologies to help all the transaction in the capital markets on this platform, and from the fundraising, secondary markets, registrar, depository, investor service intermediaries, and it could be applied to the digital asset industry as well. So I don't know, my response is that how we can deal with this, we have to listen to each other. That's for sure. But that's very true. And I'd like to mention about our approach to issue the new regulations or propose the new amendments to the regulations or law as well. We also study from international law and in the many jurisdictions and practices, and we're trying to adapt the concept that we studied that we think that would be fit for the Thai context. And lately, I think we work pretty closely with the TDO, and that could help. Let's see. Right now, you see we have posted quite some public hearings on the amendments to our regulations, and we'll see how we could, working together on this issue. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chia, could you give us some perspective on how in Singapore regulators and industry professionals have been working together on how to strike up that conversation about a sensible way forward with developing this regulatory environment?
Yeah, I think I agree with Korn just now. He said that how the regulators could work closely with industry associations. I was the former and founding president for the Singapore Fintech Association, currently running the Blockchain Association. So we have been working quite closely with the regulators all the while. In fact, recently we have a roundtable with the regulators, especially for the digital asset space, which is still rapidly evolving, and there's a lot of unknowns out there. And I think this is where industry associations can prove to be very valuable, because they can let the regulators understand what are the market realities and practices. They can also help to preempt any implementation problems of any new regulations. They also can preempt any unintended consequences of regulations. And last but not least, by working closely with industry associations, they could foster industry understanding and gain support for the regulation. Then that will help in the implementation. So I've always postulated that just regulations is not enough. Working closely with the industry and sometimes letting the industry self-regulated, coming up with their own code of practices might be a better way to achieve managing the risk for the financial system and achieving consumer protection. Thanks.
Thank you. Kun Jirayut, can you tell us from your perspective if you've had opportunities to work with regulators on developing these frameworks?
Sorry, can you please repeat the question?
Sure, Kun Jirayut, I just wanted to ask, from your own experiences, have you had opportunities to work with regulators on advising or giving your perspective on what you feel is a good way forward to developing regulatory frameworks?
Personally, I haven't been having that opportunity to work closely with the regulators, but for the company, there are people from my team that joined the TDO. We have a self-regulated, association, Exchange Association of Thailand, called TDO, and they're working closely with the Thai regulators. trying to find the right balance and the regulations for Thailand. But it would be great if I could contribute more to the space, because I'm the longest person to be in this space for Thailand, and I've been through technology ups and downs for almost a decade now. So if I'm presented with the opportunity to help with the regulation, I would be more than happy to. But I guess going forward, with different regulators in Thailand, we should have a round table where the Bank of Thailand, the SEC, the RD, the private companies can come and share each of the local KPIs, and making sure we understand each other and we bridge the communication gap issues, and we see every facet, every dimension before we launch a new regulations or sandbox in Thailand, to make sure that we have a global nation's best KPI out, making sure that all the musician plays the same song. We need a round table, a conductor. I think going forward, that would be the best case. Thank you.
Kun Thawatchai, do we have any kind of regulatory sandboxes with digital assets in Thailand?
Well, it would be allowed, but we have to look through this, because on the traditional market, we have the regulations allow for the sandbox already, but not yet in the digital asset arena. We could talk about that, but the thing is that I think the best way to do this is to work closely, and we have the collaborations, and we could listen more about it, and we can share the view from regulatory perspective. And as I mentioned earlier, we study from artist restriction as well, and we are not gonna say that we just can't shift shift some laws of artist jurisdiction to apply totally in Thailand. But we have to make adjustment, and we have to listen to stakeholders as well. But at the policy level, we have to look through all the big pictures, because working as regulators, I know I would say it's not easy as well, because we deal with the conflicting demands from many stakeholders, and how to strike the right balance. I say this word again, and we try to do this as well. But maybe we look through these, things differently. Okay, thank you.
Is there, and I'll ask this for all of you, is there any plans to use the blockchains itself, because it's decentralized and trustless, that this technology itself could be used or applied to regulations, so that we could move forward using the advantages of this technology?
There's a lot of potential in government services, and I think that's the biggest potential area of improvement in efficiency through the use of this technology. People talk about land title deeds. People talk about even the voting systems. I think a lot of possibility, and that's why I very much feel that we need to let this grow. We need to let this area develop, including really attracting interest by the general public in the technology. And so I think that's why, if there's any final comment I'd like to make, is the mood and tone of what the regulator does and say is important. It sort of sets the tone for the rest of the population in terms of what their attitude should be towards this new sector. So when recent regulatory announcements were made, for example, restricting advertisements of crypto exchange services, eyebrows were raised. We're used to regulation concerning IPOs and offering of securities, but we're not used to companies that provide the service being regulated from advertising their services. And when the regulatory announcement go into such detail as to even ban the usage of images of the managers or shareholders of the exchanges from being used in advertising. We're thinking, we're asking, what's going through the regulators' minds here? Why that level of concern? And I think it sends out negative signals to the general public that people in charge just don't like this technology, and I don't think that's sort of helpful. I'm not against regulation at all, and I think protection of the public is an important task for the regulator, and I acknowledge that it's very difficult. But sending out the right signal, making sure that the public at least feel that the government and the regulators are positive towards the development of this new technology, but just be careful, is different from saying, hey, we don't like this, and we rather you guys go do this elsewhere rather than under our jurisdiction. So, it's that's what I'd say to the regulator if I had the chance.
Okay. Mr. Chia, could you give an example of how regulations or regulatory environments in this new era can be more responsive to the way that technology is changing and to the way that the financial environment is changing?
Yeah, so I think again, because changing or coming up with new regulations is hard. It's a multi-year process. So I think just now I mentioned, definitely a regulatory sandbox is one good way. And then the other one is really about working very closely with the industry. And I think industry associations are a very good platform for that, because given that the digital assets is a very new industry, almost every day we see new things happening, right? Constantly working with the industry, and especially during the early stages, perhaps the industry could self-regulate, coming up with the code of conduct where everyone will abide to it, can in a way buy time for more sensible regulation to come into force, rather than just outright ban it, which again then don't support the innovation, and in the process it might cost the country economic growth and jobs. Yeah, and that's just my view. Yeah.
How can you give a little bit more about if you did more self-regulation among the industry players? Can you give examples of if somebody overstepped their bounds or did something that was treading the line ethically? How would the industry police itself in this way?
So the industry will have to agree with that code of conduct, and then typically in terms of how you set up the governance process, then there will be a committee that will then agree that this particular player has crossed the red line, and then he will be somehow at the industry level, there will probably a kind of investor watch list. That will be in a way a good enough kind of punishment to me lah. Yeah, because in the industry watch list will not put it in a very positive light to their potential or even existing customers.
And is there any room for customer level, not regulation but monitoring of the behavior of these players? So, in a sense, you have, for example, online websites where you can rate services, for example, for restaurants or hotels, and people can give their opinions based on what they've seen or their own personal experiences, and then the quality of these reviews can be compared to past reviews. So there's mechanisms to try to avoid the biased reviews, for example. Is there any space for that?
I'm not too sure those mechanisms will be effective, because we also know that many of such mechanisms could be abused by the player itself and by the competitors also. Perhaps another way we can look at is really coming up with a whistleblowing kind of framework. Again, the investigation part can either be done at the industry association level or jointly together with the regulator. I thought those will be a more sensible way to do it. Of course, rating could be part and parcel of the entire thing, but I think solely relying on the consumer rating, I think there are still a lot of flaws unless we have very good ways to mitigate the kind of risk.
Okay, that's a good point. Kun Jirayut, do you have anything that you would say would be a very, if you had the chance to make a quick fix or something that you thought was an area that could be addressed relatively quickly to help the entire industry? Would you say there's any parts that, in your opinion?
I can hear the background noise.
Sorry, Kun Jirayut, can you hear me still?
Okay, please.
There's a crossed line.
Is there somebody else on the line? I don't hear anything on my side, but I'm sorry if you're hearing a little bit of cross talk on your side. The question to you again: do you feel like if you had an opportunity to approach the regulators and say,
I'm sorry, the admin, can we please stop?
Excuse me. I think there's, can we get somebody to tell them to be quiet? Okay. All right. So can I come back to Kun Thawatchai? What do you, in your opinion, what do you think would be something that on the regulatory side could happen relatively soon in trying to address these concerns?
Well, firstly, I think I'd like to respond to Kun Thaw's comment as well. About the proposed amendment to the advertisement regulations, and we didn't propose the prohibition on the advertisement of the service of the business operators, and what we put some restriction on the advertisement in public arena is the cryptocurrency advertisement and cryptocurrency, and this is the only products that we proposed the restriction because we studied it from the guideline on provision of the digital payment tokens of the Singapore that the MAS just imposed recently. So this is where it come from, and I'd like to make clear that it is very. I agree that if we are going to propose the ban or restriction on the advertisement of the services of the business operator, it's not reasonable. That's why I think that it's not what we proposed, and let me make it clear in this point. But thank you, Kun Korn, for raising because I have a chance to respond to this. But to be honest, the proposal has been criticized in some other contents of it as well, because, for example, the pre-approved process for the advertisement that we proposed, and we will welcome the public comments and from the industry as well. So somebody proposed that whether or not we could deal with it by the SRO type, and whether or not we can allow the industry to do it by themselves. And I think we have to consider this kind of comments as well, and we'll see whether it's going to be possible, and whether or not we can make some adjustment on this. And anyway, that's what I like to address on this issue.
Okay, thank you. Can I go back to Kun Jirayut? I just wanted to ask you again the question about if you had an opportunity to raise an issue with the regulators that you felt was something that could be addressed relatively quickly, maybe even painlessly, to help the Thai market when it comes to the digital asset space. What issue do you think you would identify that could be looked at?
Sure. I think most of the regulated players are good in nature, good actors. We are fully transparent. Otherwise we won't be applying for the license, right? And most of the scams and the bad actors are the one unregulated, and all the illegal activities are happening underground. So I think it is important for the regulated players and the regulators work together to find the right balance, making sure that things are on ground, finding the right balance, not pushing all the activities underground, and that's going to be harder to control. We need to bring all the activities up on ground and make sure we can monitor, we can have all the data. We should act as a collective data point for the country, and making sure we can control all the risk. And to do that, regulators and all the players must work together to make sure that the regulated players are not bringing like a knife to a gunfight, because otherwise even the good actors are going to lose in the long run because of all the regulatory burden, and all the activities, all the bad actors are still going to be happening anyways, but we can't really control them. Everything it would be going underground. So I think the best advice, I think, on my end is to bridge this communication gap, and also the mindset that we are actually the same team. We are trying to do the best for the industry, for the country, making sure we are trying to allow innovation to foster, but at the same time protecting investors, making sure that investors are fully educated, right? How to store, fully keeping customers' assets safe, and making sure illicit activities are not happening on the platform, and being able to monitor and collect the data point for the country. So we are actually the same team and trying to find the right balance for the country. Otherwise, if we cannot, combine the two forces together and trying to only punish or regulate the transparent ones, all the illicit activities are going to happen regardless, but they're going to happen in an underground manner that nobody can collect the data point for the country, nobody can control, and investors are not going to be protected anyways, especially overseas, right? Where we can't really trace or talk to the operators overseas. It's boundaryless, it's borderless now. The internet, there's no friction to move the innovations outside of Thailand or the illicit activities outside of Thailand. So my suggestion would be to share that we are actually the same team, trying to find the best solutions for the country, and making sure we launch something that is really best for the country, and finding the right balance. We're a fintech company. We're not a financial company, or we're not a tech company. We are not moving fast and breaking things like Facebook. We fully understand this because we have a lot of customers' assets, right? Not like Facebook, they can move fast and break things. But at the same time, we also need to look at innovation as another country's KPI now, as the next S-curve for the country to foster with the digital economy coming up in the next decade, right? We cannot move too slow. We are not a financial company either. We need to think of the industry as a fintech space, right? Finding the right balance between financial and tech as a whole.
Kun Chia, can I come back to you and ask you, can you address the challenge that might be where your regulators may not have all of the information that the front line, which is the industry players, have, and that as things are changing, they may not be digesting the information of these new developments as quickly as the industry players? And how do you foster the communication between regulators and the industry players so that everyone's on the same page? Chia?
Oh, the question is for me, is it?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah, I think once a player is regulated, there are certain reporting requirements. So I think those things are important for the regulator to understand what is happening. But it's also equally important that the regulators themselves to have the competency and the capability to independently verify those numbers. And the good thing about blockchain is that a lot of these transactions are on-chain, which means that to a certain extent and with the right tools, which currently a lot of tools are available, then that will form a very good the surveillance framework for that. Basically, the regulatory requirement for reporting and the ability to independently verify those numbers.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Mr. Chia. Thank you to all of our panelists, Kun Korn, Chatikavanij, former Minister of Finance and founder of the Thai Fintech Association, Kun Thawatchai, Pittayasophon, Assistant Secretary General Legal of the Securities and Exchange Commission Thailand, Mr. Chia Hock Lai, Co-Chairman of the Blockchain Association of Singapore and CEO of Switchnovate, and Kun Jirayut Srupsrisopa, founder and Group CEO of Bitkub Capital Group Holdings Company Limited. We really do appreciate your time and your insight into sharing or shedding some light onto this very exciting new space that is going to become more and more a part of our lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
สวัสดีครับ
สวัสดีครับ